17-year-old. Her favorite forms of self-care include singing, reading, walking outdoors, and laughing out loud. Please welcome Dr. Armstrong.
Thank you so much for that very gracious introduction. And thank you to the North Carolina Council of Churches for all of the tremendous work you do in our state. And I'm sure that your influence is felt well beyond in terms of the issues that you raise and for which you advocate. So I am pleased to begin our conversation today about faith and mental health. And I'm going to share my screen. Give me just a moment. And it is my intention that we'll have some time, hopefully at least 10 minutes at the end of our session today for your questions. It is perfectly fine for you to populate those questions in the chat, and our moderators will assist me in being aware of your questions. So I'd like to go ahead and begin talking today about mental health through the lens of faith. And I'm gracious that Meredith has opened us up in prayer. And I want to say I speak fairly frequently. I love giving out information, but I also want to make sure that this presentation is about inspiration. So I do want you to just take a moment before I start giving you information to ground yourself, to remember who you are as a child of God and many other identities that you may embrace, to make sure that you are aware of what's happening in your mind, your body, your soul, and your spirit, and to open yourselves to how spirit may be moving today in this presentation. So let's begin by defining mental health. Now, this is not an official APA definition, but this is one that I like to use when I'm having conversations with persons who are maybe not nuanced in some of the jargon that we use sometimes in psychology or even in theological circles, but just simply a description of mental health. So mental health is first about finding balance emotionally, mentally, behaviorally, socially, and spiritually. And the truth of the matter is that there are probably many other areas in which we experience mental health and wellness, but those are ones that I tend to focus on in my daily work as a psychologist. Defining mental health is also about gaining and maintaining healthy functioning across different spheres of life. That can sometimes be more challenging than it sounds. Because sometimes we have mastered ways of being present and optimizing our functioning at work, for example, or in our homes. But the question is, are we able to maintain that functioning across spheres? In the ways that we may show up in our faith communities, is that consistent with who we are when we are in our neighborhoods or speaking with our family members, right? So it really is about healthy functioning. And this is even how mental health professionals help to measure the degree of wellness or illness in the populations that we treat. Mental health is also about recognizing the influences of biology, family history, personality differences, life experiences, and so on. And so I think we can agree that while we are people of faith, there are certain biological realities that we confront in our bodies. There are certain aspects of our family history that do, in fact, have an impact on us, no matter how faithful we may be. There are personality differences that exist within your congregation, whether it is a congregation of 50 or 5,000, right? So all of these are areas and factors that we navigate as we strive for mental health. Now, I want to talk for a few moments from Christian scripture about the evidence that we have regarding the importance of our minds. And I would venture a guess that many of you are very familiar with some of the scriptures that I'm sharing here today. But I wanted just to render a reminder of how we know that God is interested and concerned about our minds. So Isaiah 26 and verse 3 reminds us that God will keep us in perfect peace when our minds are steadfast. And the steadfastness occurs because we're trusting in God. Or how Romans 12, verse 2 reminds us that our goal is to constantly be renewing our minds, not to be conforming to the patterns of the world, but renewing our minds so that we then can test and approve God's good, pleasing, and perfect will for our lives. All right. So the mind is central to these scriptures. And also this one. I would also like to share my observation that some of the positive psychology that has been studied and is mentioned frequently in a lot of the psychological literature, I think really is grounded in many ways on this very verse of Philippians chapter 4, these verses 4 through 8. Well, I like 4 as well because it reminds us to rejoice always, but especially 6 through 8. And it just reminds us to not be anxious about anything. If I pause there and I ask you, how are you doing with that? How was your week of watching everything that's going on in the world and still being not anxious about anything? Right. So probably all of us are kind of stretched to see how do we aspire to the scriptural advice, not to be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving to present our requests to God. And it reminds us of how God will not only help us to have peace that transcends all understanding, but guards our hearts and our minds in Christ Jesus. And so verse 8 reminds us of what to focus on, right? So there are untrue things and ignoble things and unpure things, unlovely things that are happening in our world, in our lives, in our homes. And yet the scripture reminds us when our minds are focused on the request of God and the peace of God that we are achieving higher levels of wellness. Okay. And then just a reminder that when Jesus himself was asked about the greatest commandment, he paired together the notions of loving God. And regardless of our faith tradition, we all fully aspire to that. That is a very important part of who we are as spiritual people, that we love our Creator. But Jesus reminds us that in addition to that, what is also very important is loving neighbor and loving self, right? So, all of those, when we really are meditating on those truths in our minds, they have a way of being able to, if you will, inspire and spill over into our total well being. Okay. So, I want to share this image with you. I remember several years ago coming across this in another reading. And I was so inspired by it that I reached out to Dr. Travis, John Travis, who developed it, to gain his permission to actually include it in my book. And I still think it's a very useful way of our grounding ourselves in understanding illness and wellness. So as you can see from the image, illness and wellness is on a continuum. And I think one of the errors that we sometimes make as humans, not just people of faith, but humans in general, we tend to think that if we're not demonstrating the signs and the symptoms of illness, if we don't have any type of disability, that we tend to think that we are well, right? So I'm not ill, so I must be well. But what this image reminds us about is that when we don't have illness, it also doesn't necessarily mean that we are well. It just shows us that we're at a neutral point in our functioning. Okay. And for sure, illness is a valid concept. Scripture speaks about illness and even how Jesus himself interacted with illness. But we know that when illness is untreated, it can lead to premature death. But let's remember that if we really want to pursue wellness, and I love that this series is called The Abundant Life, webinar series, because in John 10 and 10, Jesus himself states that he's come that we might have abundant life, right? And so in my view, abundant life is associated with wellness that is gained as we increase our awareness about topics. So hopefully by your very participation in this webinar today, you're increasing your awareness about where mental health fits into our faith and how they're related to each other. It's also about education, about our growing, and growing is a sign of change. And as you heard from my bio, I've worked with many different people of faith in counseling contexts, in educational contexts, and so forth. And sometimes change is not a given. Sometimes we can be very, very comfortable in where we are. And so we are called, in order to expand our wellness, I believe we're called to continue to grow. And as we pursue those aims, then we're moving toward higher levels of wellness. Now, I want to first talk about the left side of that continuum that I just showed with you, the one that's focused on illness, because indeed there are bona fide illnesses and mental health challenges, and the mental health community often refers to the DSM-5-TR, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in its now fifth edition, and the text revision came out in 23. And so from the DSM-5-TR, we know that there are several different challenges that are described and that are used to help diagnose when someone is having a clinical disorder. And so those challenges will include areas such as depression and anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal thoughts and behaviors, bipolar disorder, considered on the continuum of mood disorders, disruptive behavior disorders, ones that we may more likely see in children and teens, but not exclusively, autism and autism spectrum disorders, schizophrenia, substance use disorders, and dementia and related disorders. So there are specific areas in that DSM-5-TR that speak to those disorders. There's lots and lots of research to demonstrate that they do occur. And not all of us regard science in the same way. I want to acknowledge that. But I would say that all of us at some point in our lives have encountered persons who have suffered from the signs and symptoms of these disorders. And to the degree that we are sensitive, we know how impairing these symptoms can be, even at a mild level. And so I think that having this discussion is really about exposing the elephant in the room, being able to recognize that faithful people, people who have perhaps been born into the church, or people who have come to the church later in life, or people of faith who are maybe not affiliated with a faith community, but perceive themselves and live their lives as spiritual people, all deal with these kinds of mental health challenges in themselves and or in their families. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about what these challenges look like. You know, sometimes we have the experience of interacting with someone or with some situation, and we're not exactly sure what's going on, but we kind of think, something's not right. Okay, so I find it useful to describe some of the signs and symptoms of mental health challenges. And I was intentional in writing my book to make sure that we included vignettes of, regular everyday people who were dealing with several of these challenges, just to help the public understand, oh, that's what depression looks like, right? And other examples. Okay, so when we're talking about signs and symptoms of mental health challenges, we are, for one, observing that there can be frequent, intense, or long-lasting changes in mood. Okay, if you've ever stepped into a room with someone who was having mood challenges, you can feel it in the air, right? You feel it in how you interact with that person. You feel it perhaps when you're looking in the mirror. right? That mood changes are a sign that there may be some mental health challenges. And what you're going to notice in my conversation today is that even though I'm speaking for the moment about mental health challenges and DSM-5 TR, one of the conclusions I hope you'll draw is that we're all on the continuum. I find it divisive for us to kind of use the language of us and them when we're talking about persons with mental health challenges, because on any given day, we could be dealing with any of these signs and symptoms, and perhaps several of them. So let's humbly keep that in mind. So, in addition to mood changes, there also can be worry or fear that occupies our minds most of the time. Um, Perhaps in the last few months, that has increased for the general population at large. But sometimes worry and fear is a constant that is there and that actually has a negative impact on our functioning, our ability to be present and to fulfill some of the tasks and duties that come along with whatever our identity may be. We also see that there are problems communicating effectively with others. Okay, so this one is not so much associated with a concrete diagnosis, but I assure you that in some of our relational challenges, we can often encounter communication problems. And it's also um, sometimes convenient for us to think that those problems lie on the other side of the communication pattern or the dyad or the group. But often there are ways that we, again, can look in the mirror and find ways that we can improve communication. And how people communicate actually does have an impact on the mental health of the couple, of the family, of the classroom, and so forth. All right, so communication is indeed connected to mental health. Signs and symptoms of mental health challenges also include physical complaints that do not have a medical explanation. So I will certainly acknowledge that often there are physical complaints that have not yet been properly diagnosed. Okay, so that certainly is a reality. But sometimes when we have somatic complaints, they may be either associated with something psychological or they can benefit from psychological support because of the ways that they impact and interfere with our full functioning. Another very common set of challenges, signs, and symptoms with mental health are associated with a history of trauma, abuse, or neglect. So the adverse childhood experiences measure is something that we use when we have an intake of a new client in our practice. And we actually ask about some of these areas because we know that not only the history can have an impact in the past, or has had an impact in the past, but continues on into the present and can impact the future without intervention. And then finally, for now, I want to bring to your attention the difficulty functioning in job, family, or community roles and relationships. So when we see that difficulty, the difficulty in and of itself may not be diagnostic, but it helps give us some evidence that there may be something going on. And I am intentional about meeting with my clinical staff twice per month, and I'll show you a picture toward the end of our session together. But in that staff meeting, in those meetings, we talk about ways that we non-judgmentally interact with those who have these and other types of challenges. So the focus is not necessarily figuring out what did you do to cause this, but how do we help given this history and these challenges that you're having. All right. So, as you've heard, I have worked for over 20 years in church ministry and a counseling ministry. I also did want to note for the record, thank you for the elevation, but I am not a reverend, I'm a minister. And what I have learned in serving ministry populations, the community at large, serving in educational institutions, is these things. One, that God loves us deeply and is concerned about our wholeness in mind, spirit, body, and soul. Sometimes our congregations focus on the spirit and maybe not as much on some of those other areas. But as we understand who God is, we know that God is concerned about our wholeness. Second, I know that God gives us the resources of psychologists, psychotherapists, counselors, psychiatrists, and other experts in mental health care to help promote our emotional well-being, right? And so, as faithful as we may be in our own beliefs and our traditions and our practices, we may or may not have a lot of resource information when it comes to emotional well-being. Okay. One of the delights that I had when I was on the faculty at Duke Divinity School is that I taught a number of pastoral care classes, and I really enjoyed teaching those classes. But I will say that because it was not required for the vast majority of our students at the Divinity School, I had fairly small classes. And so it is often the case that our pastors may not have the foundation to be able to promote both our spiritual and emotional well-being. And so there are resources in the community that I believe God gives to us to help us in that area. Again, in the uh, pursuit of full wellness, full wholeness. I also know that God calls us as individuals and as faith communities to gain skills and support to navigate our emotions faithfully, right? And so we aren't born into the world with these necessarily. Some of us have stronger instincts for compassion than others, but we all can learn the skills of how to navigate our emotions more faithfully, how to seek out the support that we need. And fourthly, for now, I know that our emotional and spiritual well-being builds the resilience that we need to manage the vicissitudes of life. If we had a moment, and I'm looking forward, by the way, to the Faith Health Summit in Sanford in March as a time where we'll have a little bit more time to unpack these things. But if you just take a few seconds and you think about what are the vicissitudes that I personally have experienced in the last 30 days, I imagine that you'll have more than just a couple things on your list, right? And so we need resilience to be able to navigate the curveballs, if you will, the ways that life throws us curveballs. And yes, we are to count it all as joy, but they are still curveballs. So resilience, let me give you a definition of resilience. This is a definition that comes from the American Psychological Association's Dictionary of Psychology. Resilience is the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult and challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. Okay. So as you can see from this description, there's a lot that is required in our attainment of resilience. But I believe and have believed from my undergraduate years when my mentor encouraged me to pursue this integration of spirituality and faith. I have known that psychology can be a powerful tool for helping us as people of faith to build resilience. And so here are some examples of some skills and resources that help us to build resilience. And I'm very mindful of the skills and support that are needed as I glance through social media, especially in the last couple of months. You know, people are really seeing images on television, hearing news stories, having emails and letters in their inboxes at work that are very threatening to their sense of self. And so these are the times that we need resilience. And here are some skills and resources. For one, emotion regulation. So you go to work, you're a federal employee, and you've got this indication that your job is at risk. Your job that helps you to support your family, your job that gives you a sense of identity. your job perhaps even that you enjoy in the ways that you serve the public, and now it is threatened. And so, under threat, our brains communicate that we need to guard ourselves. We need to refocus our resources. There are all kinds of neurochemical reactions that are happening in the face of threat, and they're there for a very good reason. They protect us, right? But what happens when it feels like this is not just a tiger chasing you, but an issue that's going on for days and weeks and months and years, right? You need tools of emotion regulation to know how to respond to chronic threats, right? And emotion regulation as if you will, as a concept, has many subskills inside to help you to know in the face of threat and chronic threat, this is how you respond emotionally. And your healthful response will lead to resilience or healthy communication. What happens when you are having conflict in your relationship with a family member, or perhaps in relationship with someone else who is a co-laborer in your ministry, right? These are situations where it can be very easy to lose hope, to be discouraged, to want to step away from what your role is. But if you believe that God has a calling for each of us, that calling does require us to run the race, to show endurance. Remember the Apostle Paul, for those from the Christian background, who talks about how he's run the race and he's finished. And that is not an easy feat, right? So healthy communication gives us the endurance even in difficult situations. And then body awareness can be very important to resilience, right? So when we are aware of what's happening in our bodies, we can actually give more attention to not only our physical selves, but also to how whatever may be happening in our body, for example, some sort of ache in the pit of your stomach when you're anxious, how that is actually contributing to the way that you perceive information that's happening in your world. It becomes a type of filter that has a way of perhaps altering your perception about things that are happening in your life. So being aware of your body and being able to have control over that pit in your stomach, for example, is a way that you can increase resilience. We also know that having social support that is edifying can be very important for us. So you will notice that up to this point, I've talked a lot about what we as individuals can do. And from what I have been told in my church raising, it may be that we encounter St. Peter at the pearly gates, and we have to account for no one else but ourselves. Okay. However, we also know that part of our faith is understanding our role within the context of a body, of people, of networks, right? And so we are created to be sustained not only by God, but by social support. And notice that I've modified that as edifying social support, because we can also be around folks that are not building us up but tearing us down. So in March, I'll be talking about boundaries in a little more detail. And then finally, the skills and resources that help build resilience. The final example for today is advocacy for self and others, recognizing how Jesus advocated for people in his midst. You remember how Jesus defended the woman who was about to be cast with stones because of her being discovered in an adulterous affair, right? Jesus advocated that if everyone just kind of looked in the mirror for a moment, there would be no stones to cast, right? And he was correct. We also know that even the Good Samaritan has been held up as an example of simply advocating for someone else who is our neighbor, right? And that's connected to the narrative about defining who our neighbor is. Our neighbor is the person for whom we advocate. And if you are aware, you can easily identify a neighbor who does need your support. So, with that said, let us sort of transition to thinking about ways that our churches or faith communities can promote emotional well-being. Okay, so I know that many of you are affiliated with in some way or connected with, maybe even unofficially, with faith communities. Others of you may not be affiliated in that way, but I know that in the sense of community that you may be a part of wherever you are, I encourage you to think about these steps for promoting emotional well-being. So first, start at home. And I literally mean at your place of abode. Look at your relationships. Look at how you may or may not be able to experience emotional regulation or healthy communication or feel support, right? So sometimes we have to really look at what's happening in our own environments before we decide to invest in other spaces, other people, other areas, right? So start at home. You can also think about that in a more figurative way in terms of starting with your own faith community or your own neighborhood or your own city, right? Because there are always global opportunities for us to have an impact, but let's start local. I also encourage you to think about risk prevention. I really feel privileged in having been born into my current church home. Other than my time away in New Haven, I have been a part of one church community for all of my life. And for some of you, that's like a very scary thought that that would be my experience. But I appreciate my experience, and I appreciate the ways that my church, Union Baptist Church in Durham, has really helped me to think about what health and wellness look like, not just from do you or don't you have a diagnosis, but what does the abundant life look like? So, in abundant life thinking, we are not only trying to save the people coming downstream who've already been hurt and abused and neglected, but we're thinking about how do we not only maintain but increase health? How do we promote health in our congregations? We also can help to reduce stigma in these ways. One, we can acknowledge and normalize the presence of mental illness. Okay. Sometimes, if we don't talk about it, the absence of the conversation can indicate that it is a taboo subject. We also can teach and preach and pray on the subjects of mental illness and mental health and wellness, right? So the continuum. Yes, the person that is sitting next to you on the pew may be dealing with panic attacks, but the person that is two people down may also be dealing with some relationship challenges, and the person in the mirror may be dealing with some issues around depression. So we want to normalize that this is a part of not just the human experience outside of faith, but within faith as well. We can also think about reducing stigma by developing a Sunday school class, a Bible study, or some other educational and supportive group that is relevant to life struggles and hurts. Okay. Because if we don't think in a dichotomy about either you're ill or you're well, we can think about how do we continue to strive toward greater wellness, regardless of where we may have started. And then I think this one's really practical and important. Maintain a referral list of mental health professionals and resources. I could say a lot about that, but I will say that the time not to do that is at 2 a.m. when you get the call from the suicidal congregant and you're trying to figure out what do we do next, right? So I encourage congregations to really be proactive about that referral list, and I'll give you some tips in a moment about how to develop that list. All right, so other things churches can do is to observe special events throughout the year. So I've given a very short list of things that can certainly be added to. But May is observed in the US as Mental Health Awareness Month. July is National Minority Mental Health Month. in September is Suicide Awareness Prevention Month. Okay. There are many, many other ways that we can observe and, if you will, celebrate these observances, whether they be days or weeks or months. And I say celebrate in the sense that we raise awareness of them. We celebrate the fact that even when persons are struggling in these areas, that we as a community are committed to being able to be a solace for them. I also would encourage you to think about developing programs that emphasize people's strengths, yet leave room for their struggles. Sometimes we have perpetuated a narrative of who we are as people of faith that may not line up with the realities of who we actually are by faith, right? We know that Jesus is victor, and Jesus is also the suffering servant, right? So, in as much as we are created in God's image, we show forth all of that in our own existence. And then I encourage you to comfort rather than alienate families whose loved ones are dealing with mental health symptoms or have attempted or completed suicide. There's something called disenfranchised grief that sometimes we unwittingly will succumb to. We can be very busy in our faith and our focus on the victorious parts of our faith that we may leave persons who are suffering behind. And there are specific supports that allow us to overcome that fault. So let's equip our ministry leaders and laity to recognize symptoms and to connect to resources. So this is a list of some of the resources that I've encountered during my time in serving the church. Those include Mental Health First Aid, Stephen Ministry. I'm a very big proponent of Stephen Ministry and would be glad to speak to anyone offline about that. Faith Connections on Mental Illness. It is a locally initiated national program. Binkley Baptist Church in Chapel Hill started this. They have annual conferences with nationally and internationally known speakers. And I certainly encourage you, if you're thinking at all about how your church can serve those with mental illness, this is a great organization with which to affiliate. Also, other programs include Divorce Care, Celebrate Recovery for Substance Use. Griefshare.org has a tremendous list of grief support groups that are available. I have found their staff to be extremely helpful in giving guidance. And you can go to that website and search your zip code, and you can probably find at least a handful of opportunities to be involved in a grief support group. I do know that even before COVID, some of them were virtual, and now even more are virtual as well as in person. And then the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI's FaithNet, I've listed the website there. But that is a great way to connect with a national organization that is being very intentional about integrating faith into the ways that we understand mental illness. So I've listed here some resources for managing mental health crises, and I'm just going to leave this up for a few moments. In fact, I'll come back to it because it's about time for us to do some Q&A. But I do want you to be aware that these resources are available, as are ways to locate a therapist for ongoing work. So I've listed just a few resources, but they're pretty robust resources. And I think starting to do work and reaching out, having phone calls, requesting brief consults can be a way to find someone who is uniquely suited for your faith and your mental health needs. And so this is a picture of our staff from the most recent retreat that we had. This is not all of our providers, but this is our providers and admins. And we are very excited about, if you visit our website, which I'll show you in a moment, we are about cultivating psychological and spiritual wellness for all ages. Also, that's an image of my book. And this is our contact information at the Armstrong Center for Hope. So I'll leave that up for a second and then go back to the resources page. But I hope that I've shared something with you today that has inspired some thought, some idea about how you individually, as well as you as faith communities, can promote emotional well-being and resilience. Okay, so at this time, I will check in with our moderators to see if there are questions, comments.
Dr. Armstrong, can you, tab back possibly to the resources? Someone said, can you go back to the last slide, but I'm not, I think it's the first slide of resources, so maybe the slide before that.
I think this one is the first page, or did they mean
Okay.
these ministries?
I'm not sure.
The first one you had, it was there.
This one?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
We have another comment in the chat that says, I'm not sure that GriefShare will work with United Methodist churches anymore now that we support LGBTQ plus inclusion. I've heard of them refusing to sell their materials to a UM church. Mind you, that's something I've heard and might be wrong.
Okay, so I was not aware of that, and I thank the speaker for sharing that. I would suspect that if you are wanting to be a trainer, that does present a challenge. But I also would encourage us to think about griefsupport.org as available to individuals. And to my knowledge, they are not screening out people who want to participate as individuals in the group. And please make me aware of that is also not the case. But it would be great to be able to host a group. But if we are UMC and we have congregants that need that kind of support, I believe they can still be referred elsewhere.
We have another question that says, I'm wondering about boundaries regarding safety when welcoming those with mental health challenges.
All right, so mental health challenges themselves are on a continuum. You may have possibly 20% of your congregation at any time that is dealing with mild to moderate depression. And we find that persons who are depressed may not present the same sort of threat as someone who is actively psychotic and schizophrenic. So to be sure, churches do need to think about ways of both serving and showing compassion to the person with the mental illness, but also protecting those who do not exhibit those symptoms. And so probably, I would say in my experience, 21 years at our local church, we certainly had experiences where persons would present with those kinds of egregious symptoms. And usually we would manage them on an ad hoc basis. And by manage, I mean that we would think about how can this person be best served to alleviate their challenges. So we give attention to the individual. Does this person need medication? Does this person need to be hospitalized? Is this person, for example, unsheltered and needs to have some way of getting health insurance to begin getting the mental health treatment that he or she needs? So those questions are important to ask, but it also may be the case that boundaries do need to be set for the life of the congregation. Because we've also had experiences, quite frankly, where the pastor's sermon has been interrupted by someone with these kinds of challenges and how they're behaving in the context of worship. So very good question.
We have another question that says, should whole families seek care if they have a family member suffering, such as PTSD?
So more often than not, and depending on how long that family member has been suffering, the answer is yes, because that mental illness has a way of rippling across the entire family unit and in different ways. So again, I mentioned personality differences at the top of this event, and we know that people can, for example, be responding to someone with PTSD. One person may be very hands-off and avoidant. Another person may be enmeshed and over-involved. Another person can be fairly stoic in their interactions. And so each person is, regardless of what they display in their behavior and their reactions, they are deeply affected by that event. And so family therapy can be arranged. I was privileged recently to begin work with a family that included adult children, and was very much needed to address not only issues that they're having now, but how those issues stem back from a couple of decades. And so family work is available and can be really helpful for supporting the family unit as well as the individuals therein.
There is another question that says, are there any programs specific to pastors' mental care?
Very good question. So I have a colleague who actually grew up in my neighborhood. It tickles me that we've kind of ended up in similar work. But this is Dr. Regine Preschold Bell, and she is the director of the Clergy Health Initiative. So the Clergy Health Initiative is really more focused on research around pastors and their health writ broadly, and not necessarily focused on treatment per se, but very interested in helping pastors and other clergy members to understand the dynamics that are unique in the calling into ministry and how people can respond. And I actually was just having a conversation with her over the weekend, bumped into her at the gym, and we talked about, the possibilities of making sure that persons who are under their study also understand that the Armstrong Center for Hope is a space for them and their support. In terms of other spaces in our community specifically for pastors, I'm not familiar with a center or an agency that's exclusively devoted to pastors, but I will say that at the Armstrong Center for Hope, we have about 4 or 5 of our providers who actually have formal training in ministry and or Christian counseling, some of whom serve in ministry capacities to the day. And so they are sort of formally trained to address issues that pastors may be dealing with. But as a whole, our practice has a culture of integrating a spiritual focus when our clients request that. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause here. I thank you all for your attention, your participation, your questions. And for those of you who may be participating in the Faith Health Summits that are coming up, hopefully you'll have a chance to delve even deeper into this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Armstrong. We're actually going to show a slide right now that has some information about our upcoming events. So Dr. Armstrong mentioned that there is a Faith and Mental Health Summit happening in Sanford. We have 3 regional Faith and Mental Health Summits that are happening in person coming up. The first is in Asheville on February 27th. The second is within the central part of the state in Sanford on Thursday, March 13th. And then the last is in the eastern part of the state, and that will be in Greenville on Thursday, April 3rd. So it's open to anyone from faith communities, the public. If you or you know somebody that might be interested or would like to come and network, we welcome that. And then this is our first of 6 webinars that we'll be hosting. The next one will happen on Thursday, February 13th at noon. That is on the community health needs assessment. So if you received an email regarding this webinar, you will receive follow-up about our coming webinars, but we would love to have you tune into those and engage in more conversation regarding faith and mental health. So if you all want to take a picture of this, we'll have upcoming emails from our team, but this is kind of a synopsis of both webinars and in-person events coming up.
Dr. Armstrong, someone did want to know, would we be able to share the slide deck
Yes.
with our participants? Okay.
Yes, as long as there's attribution, certainly.
And if you all think of any follow-up questions or concerns or feedback, we would love to know that and hear from you. This is our email, and this is the Partners of Health and Wholeness website, where there's more information regarding the webinars, upcoming events, and you can tune in there. You will be receiving a follow-up email from us after this webinar ends, but we just want to thank Dr. Armstrong. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time, and thank you to everyone that tuned in today. And we're grateful that you're interested in this topic and want to bring these conversations back to your faith community. So thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you all have a blessed day. Take care.